Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I would like to mention that we're recording all the webinars, and so it will be available after. And this is a series of webinars that the ATEG is doing on the different indicators in the monitoring framework. And so, as many of you may know, for the work on ecosystem restoration, this has been in consultation between members of the ad hoc technical expert group on the indicators and the platform on ecosystem restoration, which is a collaboration of the Secretariat and FAO in support of the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and of the work of the convention. And so we have experts with us today from both Secretariat, my colleague Jamal, who leads the work on forest biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. And then we have our colleagues from FAO who will also be talking about this methodology, which is Jelena and Joe, who are working on the FERN platform under FAO. And so I also would like to quickly mention, as most of you know, that there is information on all of the metadata that is available on the SAPSTA 26 website, which we can put in the chat. And there's additional webinars which you may want to join. In particular, there's a webinar tomorrow on the global ecosystem typology, which I'm sure will be mentioned in this webinar. And so I think that these two webinars are linked, and you may wish to check that one out. So we'll also put the link to all the webinars, which is where the videos will be posted in the future, on the chat. And so with that, I'll hand over to my colleagues. Over to you, Jamal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gillian, and hello, everyone. So this is the today's series is on the indicator 2.1 on ecosystem restoration, as it was announced. We would be really happy to share with you the progress we have made together with the FAO. So the agenda, I would like just to quickly bring you through the agenda of today's webinar. We would like to start with a really short introduction on reminding everyone on the elements of the Target 2, the gaps which have been identified, and the support program which we are organizing for the countries currently and in the near future. So then we will discuss, of course, we will look at the methodology for the indicator and more closely and in details the global registry, which is the framework on ecosystem restoration and monitoring firm. At the end of the presentation, we plan to have the Q&A session, and for everything for today's webinar, we are planning like more or less 1 hour. And we hope that we will be able to cover all of your questions. So I will start with an introduction to the Target 2, and then I will hand over to colleagues from the FAO. And just a reminder for everyone, the language of the Target 2, which is to ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial inland water and coastal and marine ecosystems are under the effective restoration to enhance biodiversity, to enhance ecosystem functions and services, and enhance ecological integrity and connectivity. So the headline indicator for this target has been identified already earlier. So this is the area under restoration. So in the next slide, there are a few elements of the targets. I'm sure that everyone who is working at the country team and the national teams on setting up the targets, the national targets, and aligning them to the global targets, I'm sure that you have also done some breakdown of the language of the target to understand really the main elements. So, and we would like to briefly mention those elements, which I'm sure you have also considered while working on the Target 2. So first of all, it is important to understand the proportionality of the target. So proportion of degraded ecosystem, which will which will be set up for the restoration. So it is important for us to know, of course, ideally in this equation, it would be good to know what is the extent of degraded ecosystem, and then how much of those degraded ecosystem you are planning to restore to achieve those certain objectives for the restoration which you have in your country. It is also important for the purpose of establishing the baseline, so that we do not really shift the baseline from decades to decades, but really working on the baseline, and ideally for both, knowing how much we're what happens with the, on the side of the degradation of the ecosystem, and how much are we degrading, so that we're really coming into the nice balance. So another important elements which you see in the targets is the different types of the realms which are mentioned, and here they're mentioned only 3: the terrestrial, inland water, coastal, and marine ecosystems. So this is a very big clusters of realms, but later in the presentation, and also tomorrow, there will be a dedicated session on ecosystem classification and the approach which is suggested now for the countries to take, really to come up with a very standardized way on how we will use the ecosystems across the whole GBF, and for the target 2 as well. So another important element here is the notion, the concept of effective restoration. So the effective restoration, so what it would be understood for in different countries, but there should be some common standard and principles set up for what do we understand in the effective restoration. And we will discuss that briefly a bit later. And of course, what is also important, finally, is the outcomes which we would like to achieve through the restoration. They are, and what we see in the language of the targets is, of course, we see enhancing biodiversity, we see enhancing ecosystem functions and services, ecological integrity, and connectivity. So basically, we can kind of very broadly group that for restoration for biodiversity benefits, and the restoration for ecosystem functions and services, which sometimes would also include the socioeconomic, the well-being, the food security, and all kind of different more functional uses of ecosystems. The next slide. Right, so the target 2 of the GBF has its predecessor targets, the Aichi Biodiversity Target 14, which called for restoration to ensure the essential ecosystem services, and Aichi Target 15, which called for the restoration of 15% of degraded ecosystems. So as you see now in the GBF, the countries decided to merge those targets, and of course the ambition has also doubled. So from 15%, now we're up to 30%, at least 30% to be set under the restoration by 2030. Both of those targets, I have to say, 14 and 15, have not been fully achieved. And in the past decade, really realizing that the countries are struggling to set up the target or struggling to communicate the target, the COP13 adopted a short-term action plan on ecosystem restoration, so-called STAPER, which was the set of principles for ecosystem restoration in a very broad sense, applied to different type of ecosystem, both terrestrial and marine and ocean ecosystems. And the same decision which adopted STAPER also requested the executive secretary to support the parties, the efforts of the parties in making use of this guide of the STAPER by enabling activity building and supporting the use of the tools in collaboration with the relevant partners and initiatives. I have to mention that there were several regional workshops organized, and the Secretariat, together with the partners and different initiatives, undertook the capacity building. There were the online learning course on ecosystem restoration, as well as the massive online open course, which was organized together with the UNDP Learning for Nature Hub. Were all set up and were really very, very broadly utilized by different stakeholders. So, but what is important here is that by the end of the past decade, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration was launched, and of course, this is a big process and the asset what we have in the UN Decade, because it's organized in the different task forces, and we are very happy to collaborate also with the partners in across different task forces, but most particular with the task force on the monitoring. Also, the Rio Conventions, of course, TBD being one of them, but also UN Convention on Combating Desertification and UN Framework Convention for the Climate Change, also increase their ambition for restoration. So increasing the with the land degradation neutrality commitments, and also enhancing the carbon sinks. And of course, the regional, other global and regional ecosystem restoration initiatives, as those mentioned on the slides, were also were initiated and really made a very good progress. And all that actions really gave us a very good impetus and momentum to start the new decade and to achieve to start our process on achieving the GBF Target 2. The next slide, please. So this is also important to mention that despite this, the existing short-term action plan on ecosystem restoration and many other tools and guidelines available for the ecosystem restoration, still the GBF Target 2 brought some new elements, or maybe not the new elements, but those elements which have not been addressed in the past decade, and we're still carrying them on, some definitional uncertainties and ambiguities. So, and the two documents which will be presented in upcoming SBSTA session will be discussing those gaps and research needs for specific targets. So, and specifically for the Target 2, the INF document on scientific and technical needs have identified several areas of gaps areas for the Target 2. First of all, it's the restoration for sustainable livelihood and human well-being. So if the parties will decide that this is something which needs to be better emphasized for the Target 2, so that we can equally achieve the biodiversity benefits, but also achieving the sustainable livelihood, poverty eradication through the restoration. So this then this part should be really strengthened in the further guidelines in the manuals which we will be producing for the Target 2. Also, another big gap which was identified, that the guidance for the inland waters and offshore marine areas, coastal wetlands, so although they're covered by Ramsar Convention guidance, but still they need to find their place in that kind of in the CBD processes, and they should be aligned with the Target 2. And as I already mentioned, the definition of degraded ecosystems, the effective restoration, reduction of impact remediation, rehabilitation, ecological restoration, all that's, and the standardized methodology for assessing ecosystem degradation. This is, so all that uncertainties needs to be navigated by the countries when they will be setting up the Target 2. And they are not only relevant for the Target 2, but also for the Target 1 on the biodiversity inclusive spatial planning, as well as the Target 3 on protected areas and the Goal A. Another set of gaps which was identified in the monitoring framework, which will be also discussed in the upcoming session, is the effectiveness of restoration measures are not tackled by the headline indicator, and they won't be tracked by the headline indicator. So, in this gap, we really need to understand how to take the approach and to measure the improvement in biodiversity, ecosystem function, and services. Because the headline indicators only measures the area under the restoration. So we really need to have the qualitative information to be collected systematically. Next slide, please. So having all that in mind, the lessons learned from the past decade, but also the gaps which on the one hand we have inherited from the last decade, and the new challenges, the new requirements for ecosystem restoration. The UN Decade partners came together to set up so-called Target 2 roadmap to assist countries in providing the guidance for implementation and the monitoring of Target 2. And this guidance includes like a big packages of work, first of all, to further develop the indicators. And here we worked closely with members of ATEC. Further strengthening and improving the framework on ecosystem restoration monitoring firm and the data operability with other data platforms. Of course, the capacity development, awareness raising, and the support for the countries after the COP16. And just give a little bit more detail on what Target 2 roadmap is. So obviously, where do we want to be in 2030? What do we want to achieve? The Target 2 objective is the target for the roadmap. So we would like to achieve 2030 with 30% of degraded ecosystem to be under restoration. But we would like to see that. As a strong evidence to be registered and to be communicated by countries. And that is only possible if we enhance the national capacity of the countries to assess, monitor, and report on ecosystem restoration. So really building the national capacity for this bottom-up information provision. And of course, this will give a huge boost for knowledge, research, and the restoration practices. We will have, on that road, we will have few checkpoints, the important checkpoints. Of course, this year when the NBSAPs and the national targets are to be submitted. In 2025, the Target 2 group, the partners of the Target 2, will plan some regional capacity development and peer-to-peer learning through the different methods, so including also the e-learning courses, which we're planning to organize. And in 2026 and 2029, there will be national reporting and a stocktake organized by the CBD in the CBD processes. Of course, who are with us on this ride? So the big vehicle, which is provided for us by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So they are a great partner on this ride. Of course, as I already mentioned, the framework itself, the framework on ecosystem restoration monitoring, which will be presented now in the second part of the presentation. To make this all happen, as this is a very close collaboration between the CBD, FAO, UNEP, and the number of partners under the UN Decade, we organized the global workshop last year in Rome. So to invite the parties and different stakeholder groups to be with us on the ride and to make sure that everything what we prepare is really addressing the needs of the parties. And one of the resource or the products which we're working on now is so-called resource manual, which will be based on the broad principles of STAPER developed in the past decade, but with the new Target 2 requirements. And that's where we will bring all the information for the parties, and we hope that will be a good reference or resource manual for the parties. And just a few more details here. For this resource manual, which we're planning to really hopefully answer most of the questions of the countries on how to deliver restoration for biodiversity and for the human well-being. So really looking at the both sides of the restoration. So this will be should be very practical how-to resource guide for both for the parties and non-state stakeholders, including the methodology and the recent data knowledge tools and the country case studies, really showing how the different countries are already setting up the target, how they're already dealing with their so many different issues, including the data, national data, national monitoring system for the restoration. And as already mentioned, we intend, this guide is intended to guide capacity building at the global, regional, and national level. And here you see just a very brief schedule, what we're planning for this guide. So first of all, the guide is already under the draft and the consultation. In May on SBSTA, we would like to present the first version at the side event. So please, those of you who will be at SBSTA, you're welcome to join the side event. And finally, at the COP16, we will launch it together with the e-learning courses for ecosystem restoration. And my final slide, this introductory part of our presentation, is just to mention those few case studies, themes which we would like to feature in the guide. Of course, the challenges, the implementation challenges for the Target 2, how the countries are creating participatory and intersectoral space to encourage and support development of NBSAPs, and how the countries organize the public consultation processes for NBSAP. Because we believe that this information will be valid throughout the GBF implementation. So development of the national strategies or policies which are supportive of the restoration, because many countries are launching and adopting these very powerful national policies, and how they are aligned, across the different restoration actors. The issues of developing the baselines, approaches to target setting, data, interoperability of the different data platform, and then really putting the spotlights on non-forest ecosystems, such as peatlands, mangrove, aquatic, inland water. So we're working, and we need to work even more and closer with those the partners which are specializing and in this and those terrestrial, different terrestrial ecosystems, including, of course, marine and ocean ecosystems. So we need to have the high quality data and really see how do we overcome the low quality data and the low capacity in some countries, and availability of data, and really engaging across the government, civil society, embracing the whole of the society approach of the GBF. And of course, using tools and guidelines to develop the key indicators for the restoration impact and biodiversity, because we really believe that many countries have a huge capacity on that, and some countries have a less capacity. So there will be a really great opportunity for the learning and experience exchange. So I'm finishing with the introductory part, and now we will go. I pass over, Elena, to you for the second part of the presentation, the indicator.
Thank you so much, Jamal. That was a very insightful presentation, providing an overview of Target 2. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Milena Feingold. I'm a forestry officer at FAO, and I am part of the coordination team on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, leading the restoration monitoring work and supporting CBD and the development of Target 2. So first, I'll here in my part of the presentation, I'll describe the indicator methodology, which is really the backbone and makes up the theory and the methods behind the firm. And so the indicator methodology is available through the metadata, which is part of the SBSA documents and available through the gbfindicators.org website. And so the Target 2 metadata, we're not starting from scratch. This methodology builds on existing guidance. It builds on the short-term action plan for ecosystem restoration that Jamal mentioned. It builds on other key documents such as the Road to Restoration, UN Decade Standards, and principles, and other existing guidance on restoration. It outlines how a restoration data set based on compiled data from restoration platforms and frameworks can be put together from various actors and at various scales, from the national, regional, and to global scale. And it encourages, of course, the use of national data sets, databases, and definitions. And it promotes the alignment and interoperability, channeling data through the framework for ecosystem restoration monitoring, which my colleague Jewel will provide further insights on the firm, showing the various parts of that system, from the data entry part, data compilation, and how we're sharing and disseminating information on restoration using the firm. So diving into the methodology itself, we have the restoration parameters. These are the key parameters to report on restoration. They include the committed area to restore. At the national scale, of course, this is clearly linked to the MBSAPs and the restoration targets. I'd like to note that these parameters and the data that we're currently collecting in the firm are currently at the project or initiative scale. So it's also a matter of collecting that data at the project level and then compiling it to the national scale. Then we have areas under restoration and selecting the appropriate units for reporting on restoration by ecosystem. And we're really encouraging the use and sharing and documentation of geospatial data on areas under restoration. So delineating where restoration is being implemented, where are the intervention areas, and sharing that for transparent monitoring and reporting of restoration. And the firm facilitates that by acting as a geospatial database. Or, of course, information can be shared in a tabular format, expressing the area under restoration by ecosystem in the appropriate unit. The ecosystems are the IUCN Global Typology, ecosystem typology. As Jillian mentioned, there'll be a webinar diving into that tomorrow. And the restoration activities and interventions, these include enabling and biophysical restoration activities, such as tree planting, sustainable management of agricultural lands, and then there's restoration type. The restoration types that are included are ecological restoration. So this is with the objective of restoring towards natural ecosystem, and rehabilitation, which focuses on restoring and improving the productivity and the condition of the ecosystem in productive ecosystems. Then we have the restoration status, which is specified. So a restoration project or initiative can be in preparation, in progress, or under some post-completion monitoring. The ones that are in bold are ones that would be counted towards area under restoration. The tenure status, which also includes identifying indigenous peoples, lands and territories, and protected areas, and the lead entity that is leading the restoration initiative or project. And so this this information is also in line with the restoration project sharing information sharing framework. And the interoperability or exchange of data using these parameters is really facilitated, and we are preparing further guidance on how to share this type of data at various scales and between different sectors. Next, for the indicator methodology and workflow, we have this workflow that's simplified into 3 steps: target setting, data compilation, and reporting. In the target setting phase, it's important to, of course, align with the target to and the indicator, keeping in mind the data disaggregations and setting up systems to allow for the multi-sectoral partnership required to report on restoration, which of course is cross-cutting and requires engagement across government ministries and across society. Then implement that in the data compilation phase. In the data compilation phase, in these blue boxes, these are interconnected processes. The national data collection and compilation will drive the reporting to the GBF, and in parallel, in the firm and UN Decade Restoration Monitoring Task Force, we're working on compiling data across global and regional frameworks and existing reporting platforms, and making that available through a data dashboard, which can also inform and feed into the national data collection and compilation. Of course, then that data is reported. Reporting can be channeled through the firm registry and then displayed in the firm platform and dashboard. And the firm will be used then to pre-populate the CBD reporting platform, which will be used for the 7th and 8th national reports. And the data that is collected in the firm will go towards reporting on the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. And so in terms of data compilation, as I mentioned, this needs to occur at different, this is occurring at different scales. At the global scale, we've been working with SDG agency custodians, Rio conventions such as UNCCD and Ramsar, and other global mechanisms such as the Global Forest Resource Assessment to identify information that is reported that is related to restoration and facilitate the data exchange. And at the regional scale, we're working with AFR 100, Initiative 2020, Great Green Wall, and other initiatives to coordinate reporting and identify linkages and synergies between these regional restoration reporting frameworks and Target 2. And of course, at the national scale, we're working with 5 pilot countries in Burkina Faso, Kenya, Peru, Vietnam, and Brazil to support the alignment of national indicators with the reporting of Target 2. And so that is the step to review and identify existing sources of data on restoration and define the interoperability or the relationship and the exchange of data between these data sources. Then this data can be displayed on the data dashboard, compiled and available in the firm, and support the country data collection. And lastly, they are reported through the firm and the CBD online reporting tool. So in terms of disaggregation, and this is outlined in the SBSTA documents, the indicator 2.1 is potentially disaggregated by the ecosystem functional group, which is level 3 of the global ecosystem typology, by indigenous and traditional territories, by protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and by type of restoration activity. I believe this is my last slide. So the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology has become really key in the Global Biodiversity Framework, and ATEC has recommended that countries disaggregate the restoration estimates by the ecosystem functional groups. There are 110 ecosystem functional groups globally. I believe countries, of course, depending on the size and diversity of ecosystems, can have somewhere on average between 20 and 30 ecosystems by country. And this is across goals A, B, and targets 2 and 3. And countries are also recommended to identify national ecosystems and crosswalk or align their ecosystem classification with the typology. So this is now quite a lot of work now that is to be done by the countries, and we recommend that the current capacities and alignment with the global ecosystem typology is assessed by the parties. And also just to note that the availability of geospatial data for the ecosystem typology is limited at the moment. There is an indicative map, but it cannot be used for quantifying the area of the ecosystems and for reporting on targets 2 and 3. There are efforts and ambitions to develop global maps for the global ecosystem typology, and hopefully this will come soon in the future. There are some initiatives by GeoBond to do this, to support the disaggregation of the target by ecosystems. So next, I will pass it to my colleague Jewel, who will provide an overview and a dive into the framework for ecosystem restoration monitoring. Over to you, Jewel.
Thank you. Thanks, Helena and Jamal, for providing the context. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jewel Chen. I'm a FAO consultant to support the the ecosystem restoration monitoring. I'm based in Rome. So without further ado, let us take a closer look at the framework for ecosystem restoration monitoring, the FIRM. The FIRM was launched in 2022. It is the official monitoring platform for tracking global progress and disseminating good practices for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and reporting areas under restoration towards Target 2 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The FIRM consists of a registry to collect restoration initiatives and good practices covering all ecosystems, a geospatial tool to visualize restoration data, and a search engine that shares good practices and initiatives powered by interoperability, and finally, a dashboard to provide analytics on the compiled restoration data. Next slide, please. So, what is the rationale behind the FIRM? When the task force on monitoring was developing the framework, we wanted to be built on collaboration to provide a collaborative framework through the Target 2 indicator methodology and standardized parameters for collecting data on restoration, to bring together other platforms and data collection mechanisms from governments and non-state actors under a common interoperable framework. The FIRM will compile data on areas under restoration to support country-led reporting towards Target 2. By encouraging the shift to reporting geospatial data for areas under restoration, the FIRM facilitates the monitoring of restoration and sharing good practices for improved implementation. And the FIRM is improving transparency, working with governments, non-state actors, and large funds such as GEF and GCF, the Global Facility. Global Environment Facility and Green Climate Fund to share areas under restoration in a centralized platform. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an overview on how to register initiatives and document good practices through the FIRM. It's a simple workflow and facilitates the data collection starting from user sign up, selecting the user will sign up, selects or creates an institution that is associated with their restoration project or initiative. Then the documentation in the documentation process, the user will enter information on the restoration initiative using standard parameters we will see in the next slide. And once the initiative context is provided, good practice can be submitted associated with the restoration initiative, and they're reviewed by the task force of best practices, also led by FAO. These initiatives and can you go back, please? The initiatives and good practices are reviewed by the institution admins and published in the FIRM platform. And the FIRM search engine now is also available to provide a centralized entry point of restoration data from various platforms and databases. It is still in development to keep up with the evolving of the methodology and guidance from ACTEC. So the FIRM registry provides a standardized form organized in 7 sections, reflecting the planning and assessment phase, implementation phase, and monitoring and reporting phase of a restoration project lifecycle. Specifically, in the general tab provides basic information on the initiative, such as title, description, objectives, etc. And in the area and ecosystems tab, users identify geographic areas by selecting admin regions, uploading or drawing a polygon, and selecting the ecosystems of the that your initiative is restoring. In the characteristics tab, users can see a set of quantitative and qualitative statistics calculated automatically for each of the areas under restoration identified in the previous tab to help users assess restoration. And next, in the activities tab, users select the activities implemented to support ecosystem restoration, including enabling activities and biophysical activities. Indicator tab is the place to select indicators to monitor the restoration progress. And based on the indicators, users can put in the monitoring tab the metric values corresponding to the metric values periodically. And finally, in the results tab, you will see a summary of the results of the restoration initiative, such as the progress of the extent of the restoration area, the proportion of area of each ecosystem under restoration, and the progress of the indicators, and a view of all the restoration areas on a map. Next slide, please. The firm team, together with partners, are developing various resources to support users using the firm registry, including regular task force meetings and pilot country work to collect feedback, a firm online user guide and frequently asked questions, a series of tutorial videos, online trainings, and as mentioned by both Jamal and Yelena, the Target 2 resource manual and the e-learning. Next slide, please. On the International Day of Forest, 21st of March, we launched the firm search engine of restoration initiatives. This is a continuation of our collaboration with Task Force on Best Practices, as the search engine of good practices was already launched last year. It's powered by the interoperability framework. Restoration initiatives and good practices from different platforms and databases are mapped and integrated into a harmonized database to facilitate the discovery of restoration data. And some of the partner platforms are listed here. And we aim to scale up the collaboration to include more partners and actors. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to present you another product of the firm closely related to the metadata, the firm dashboard. It's a place to show to visualize data compiled on ecosystem restoration. It will show the progress of commitment, so from restoration commitments to restoration practices. It will also show the disaggregation by ecosystem, and it displays initiatives and good practices. It's an interactive map to visualize national data. Thank you. So here are some mock-up, but we're still developing that. Before moving to the questions and answers, I would like to emphasize again and deliver the message from firm. So firm is designed collaboratively to support transparently monitoring and reporting of progress of ecosystem restoration and reducing reporting burdens. And thank you very much. So give the floor back to Jillian.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I do see that there is one question which is asking if all of the 7 sections of FIRM are required for the users. And maybe as you're answering this, you could also answer sort of what's required in the reporting and what is optional. And I also wanted to mention that on the ecosystem typology, although there are a lot of ecosystem functional groups, the average country has between 10 and 12. So it's not as many. So I'll hand over back to you. Maybe Elaine or Joe, you're in the best position to answer.
So yeah, perhaps I can give a first go at answering the question. And in terms of what are the required fields in the FIRM, those would be the parameters, the key parameters that I mentioned in my presentation for in the target 2 methodology. So I'm just going back to that slide. So for we have area under restoration, the ecosystems, and disaggregating that information by ecosystem, the restoration activities, restoration type, status, tenure status, and the lead entity. Then some of the optional parts of the FIRM include identifying additional indicators to monitor specific restoration. Those have been inserted to facilitate and encourage monitoring of the restoration activities in progress.
Thank you. So I think there's a few more questions. One is I'm going to ask Jamal. There was a few questions in the chat on different reports being available. I know that you also mentioned the Target 2 guidance. So if someone is trying to find all of this information, I mean, the metadata only gives a snapshot, right? So where's the best place for people to go to find the resources available? Maybe Jamal, if you want to answer.
Yes, thank you, Jillian. Right, so that's exactly how these resource or the reference guide is meant to service and to answer most of the questions. And we would like to produce this guide really as the living and dynamic document, because as we move along the road to the 2030, there will be a lot of new knowledge coming up from the country. So we really would like to keep this document open. But for now, it's just the draft, which will be presented, first of all, at SBSTA. We would like to hear from countries on what they would find would be the best way to make to organize the review process. We need to hear, of course, the SBSTA recommendations coming from the two documents, one being the monitoring and another one being the scientific and technical needs, so that we also aligned with the CBD processes. But once the guideline is finalized, the guide, it will be available both in the UN-Decade platform, but also in the clearinghouse mechanism and the NBSUB forum pages under the Target 2 resources.
Thanks. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I'm going to group there's a few questions that I'll group together. So for Zhao, there's a question on who can enter the data. So is it only governments? Is it only the UN? Is it anybody? And if it is anyone, then how is there some sort of validation?
Thank you. So the firm serves two purposes. One is to engage all actors in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. So anyone taking part in this ecosystem restoration journey can create an account and register and monitor the restoration initiatives. It's not like UN agency exclusive. The other purpose is to facilitate the reporting to the target 2 of the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, and for that we are using the interoperability, and we are creating a flexible framework to support country data collection. And we're, as Jamal said, we are going to work together to find the best way to validate the restoration data that is not reported by countries, that is from non-state actors. And we, because a lot of restoration is happening but not being reported. And one of our objectives is to make these data discoverable and can contribute to the 30% target. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think as we're wrapping up, the co-chair of the ATEG is also here, and so I will hand over to him for any sort of last minute thoughts, and then I think it's the end of the hour.
So just a very large thank you from myself, James Williams from the United Kingdom, for all of the work that the colleagues who've been presenting have been doing in the background, but also in helping the ATEG to deliver a very full mandate. Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting and very useful webinar. And I would encourage all of those who are listening in to follow the other webinars that are being presented. Gillian put the link into the chat, and there's a general webinar that I gave last week that is available as a recording now, and there's also a number that are coming forward, including one on the ecosystem typology, as Gillian mentioned. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and please do keep engaging. There's an enormous amount to try to get everybody's heads around. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining. And as mentioned, feel free to share the link with any colleagues, as we will post the video shortly. So thank you, and see you at the next webinar maybe. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.